Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee second formal evidence session in our inquiry on Brexit and local government. We are delighted to be in Manchester for this evidence session, and I would like to put on record the committee's thanks to Professor Francesca Gain and her team in the Politics Department at the University of Manchester, who have facilitated us in being able to come to the university today to hold our evidence session here. I just have a short announcement about the microphones for the benefit of both members of the committee and our witnesses, which is to say the microphones are not automated, so when you would like to speak, you need to use the button in front of you just to switch it on, and then when you finish speaking, please try to remember to switch it off. I understand the technicians are able to manually override the microphone, but particularly for the witnesses, it's quite difficult for them to tell who's speaking in order to do that. So if you could try to remember about the microphones, that would be a great help to everybody. Can I, first of all, invite members of the committee to put on record any interests that we have which are relevant to this inquiry, and I will start by saying that I employ a local councillor in my staff team in Parliament. Mike.
I also employ a local councillor in my team.
Yeah, I employ 2 councillors in my constituency office.
I employ a councillor in my team.
Now, could I ask our witnesses this morning to introduce yourselves, if that's okay, perhaps working from Mr Palmer along the row.
Hi, I'm James Palmer. I was elected Mayor of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough in May of last year. Prior to having this incredible opportunity, I was a district council leader, milkman, farmer, property developer, anything that could come along that I could do.
Thank you.
Morning, I'm Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester. Formerly the MP for Lee, and it's good to see my more than worthy successor here today. I just want to say at the beginning, it's great to see the committee meeting here in Manchester today, and it's very, very welcome that you've done that. Thank you.
Ben Houchin, Conservative Mayor of the Tees Valley. Before that, I was running my own business and also leader of the opposition on Stockton Council.
Len Duval of the London Assembly. I chair the EU Exit Committee. Prior to joining the London Assembly in 2000, I was a leader of a London borough, and I've been in elected politics since 1990.
So our first question this morning comes from me. We are 1 year away from the government's established Brexit date. Do you think the voice of local government is being adequately heard in the Brexit negotiations? Andy, do you want to?
Well, thank you, Chair. No, not at all is my answer to that question. I think what we're seeing here is, if I can put it this way, the worst of Westminster politics. It feels to me so far to have been a debate full of grandstanding and big positions without actually any meaningful engagement on the reality. And it's, as that date gets closer, that gets more serious. Greater Manchester sends 58% of its exports to the European Union. So given that the UK average is 44%, if we're burning bridges with Europe, that could hit our area very hard indeed. So we urgently need to move this. I think that's why I welcome, as I said at the beginning of the committee coming here today. I hope the committee's report might mark a kind of change in the way this is being done so far. We've, at our request, had 1 meeting as mayors, and I'm talking as the 3 northern metro mayors. We've had 1 meeting with the Brexit secretary last October. At that meeting, it was suggested that there would be some follow-up with officials. An officials working group has met once. And we've just been told, I think it came through late last week, that there'll be a meeting with the Parliamentary Under-Secretary in Cambridge in early April. I mean, this isn't meaningful engagement, particularly given there's a Cabinet Committee for the devolved administrations, and I think even British overseas territories are represented on a committee looking at Brexit. You know, urgently, the government needs to involve the voice of the English regions in this whole debate, because as we saw from the regional impact assessment that was leaked, it will have a differential impact on different parts of England, but some areas will be hit harder than others. At that meeting, we were told that there was no regional impact assessment, and then something was leaked. So, you know, it's both a lack of contact and the poor quality of what is being said to us, which I find completely unacceptable. I'm told the Mayor of London meets the Brexit Secretary on a regular basis. Well, you know, that shouldn't just be for London to have its voice heard. No disrespect to Len. You know, there should be an equal access for all English regions into this discussion, and so far it's been woefully inadequate.
Thank you. James Palmer.
Yeah, I echo some of what Andy has said. The East is, and I'll speak on, not just of Cambridgeshire, but the East has rarely had a voice with government and has been usually overlooked by either hue. I have been fortunate enough to meet with Stuart Jackson, who's the Secretary to David Davis, on several occasions, and Stuart is from my patch, so I've utilised that contact to put across things that were relevant to the economy where we are, and our economy is heavily reliant upon European immigrants, and has been for some time, particularly in farming, but also in several other areas, and of course the science and technology sector also relies heavily on free trade of scientists and free movement of scientists across Europe. So I've put the points that are relevant to that, and also spoken about movement of samples across the European Union, and the potential for a significant improvement to the hideously woeful common agricultural policy, which has so negatively affected agriculture. So there is certainly, I would like to have seen more from government, if I'm absolutely honest. I do understand the technicalities and the issues around the discussions that they're having, and I understand that there has been some movement in the right direction in recent weeks. I would like to have more input, if I'm honest, if possible. And I would, the meeting with Suella Fernandez, I'm sure, will be something where we will also put those points, all of us, to her. So I think that there's more that government could do, but I have been able to get in the room and sit down and talk to government as well. And I have got a contact that I've been utilising.
Thank you. Ben.
I think probably conversely, I've had very strong engagement from not just DEXU but wider government on what this could potentially mean for us. So I've spoken to David Davis on numerous occasions, had multiple meetings with him, and we were fortunate enough to have David Davis up to Teesport to give one of his major Brexit speeches that was setting out the transition that's hopefully going to be agreed in the coming days, if not a week or so. My officials maintain constant contact with not just David, but the rest of his team, Stuart Jackson, Steve Baker, who's been hugely supportive of us and was also helpful when we were searching for further information around the Freeport plan that we're looking to extend once we leave the European Union. COWGEX, which is the name given to the official group that has only met once so far, is my understanding the same as Andy's. I think it's the Combined Authority Working Group on Exiting the European Union, I think it stands for. There's also been an offer from the Brexit Department directly to come up and hold a summit on the chemical industry, specifically to try and garner further information and an understanding of what the North East chemical clusters might want or require from Brexit, because a significant part of UK exports in chemicals come from Teesside, never mind just the North East, and there is a 60-40 split of those exports going to the European Union, with the 40% balance going to the rest of the country. And also we've had some direct involvement with Treasury more recently, now that I met with Liz Truss and Robert Jenrick only, I think it was last week or the week before, and I met with Robert again last week to talk about an official proposal we've now got with government around the Freeport pilot post-Brexit and what that might mean to manage some of the potential opportunities we have from Brexit once we do leave. And obviously we have a huge champion in Greg Clark, who's Secretary of State for Business, who is a local Middlesbrough lad, who's a huge supporter of the region and is helping us across sectors understand what any potential impact may or may not be.
In London, of course, it's slightly different for us. We have the Mayor has established a plan on immediately after Brexit in one convening an expert panel to give him advice in terms of trying to influence government, but also in terms of meeting with key sectors in London. We on the London Assembly, primarily we hold the Mayor to account. We want to influence him in what he says to government, but we also have direct contacts with government. We've had civil servants attend our scrutiny meetings, particularly in terms of future grant regimes in replacement to EU grants. Look, I think there was an opportunity that government missed, I think, in terms of a new settlement and relationships. If we think Brexit is going to create some challenges for our country, then the way to pull all the levers is not to ignore local government at every level. And much it's about some of the regional aspects here that you're talking today, but equally there are other local government units, unitaries and others who've got something to contribute, particularly around the skills agenda. So I think the government missed establishing a new relationship post-Brexit. It needs to think carefully about that. If we're going to take in it, we are all in this together, if we can take that phrase, because they are delivery vehicles of policy and have an impact both in the world of business and the communities they serve.
Thank you. Just to explore this a little bit, there seems to be a variety of interaction between the mayors and government. And I'm just wondering, Andy, if I may ask you, as Greater Manchester is a really significant part of this whole jigsaw, and yet you've just had that one meeting, and I get the impression that you feel that the interaction isn't quite the same as everybody else seems to be talking about. Have you been proactively seeking this engagement?
Absolutely, Mary. The first meeting came about as a result of a question I asked in the House when I was still a member. I was calling for Greater Manchester to have a seat at the table. And to his credit, the Brexit Secretary in the House said, well, I'll convene a meeting of mayors, which he did. But that has been the only... we wanted then kind of a regular series of the working group, meetings of the working group that Ben referred to, and that hasn't happened. As I say, we were told there was no regional impact, and then it was leaked. So, you know, it's not been satisfactory, given, as you say, the significance of these issues to our region. I think that first answer, if I could say, and maybe say this to the chair, you know, I think it really reveals the issue, actually. And I'm not debating, you know, everyone's given you an absolutely accurate account. I think the problem is there's differential engagement going on across the country. I'll leave the committee to surmise the reasons as to why that is happening. I think the point is it has to be structured and permanent. It can't depend on whether or not you know someone in David Davis's team, or you know, it has to be an ongoing, structured, regular dialogue. There is this meeting in Cambridge, but you know, with the best one in the world, it's not easy for me to get notice of a meeting in Cambridge and then say, oh, I've got to, you know, we can't really work like that. So I don't understand why there isn't just a conference call with, you know, mayors and other leaders, local authority leaders on a regular basis, just so we can all, you know, take part and hear the latest thinking. And that just isn't happening at the moment, Mary.
Len touched briefly on the role of other parts of local government. That there has been, notwithstanding what you have said about the patchy picture as far as metro mayors are concerned, there have been some who have said that the engagement has focused too much on metro mayors and regional government at the expense of the other parts of local government across the country. And I just wondered whether you had a perspective on that issue and whether you'd like to elaborate a little bit more.
That's very fair. I mean, you know, sorry, I don't want to hog the floor here, but I mean, at least we're getting some voice. You know, if you're the leader of Leeds or Newcastle City Council or Sheffield, I guess they haven't even had what we have had. So the government needs to put this on a new footing now as we go into the very serious part of these negotiations. And we just need to understand the trade-offs that are being considered. You know, because in the end, it may come down to trade-offs between different sectors in the economy. You know, if there's an imperative to protect the financial services sector in the City of London, well, is a price being paid in a different sector? You know, we need to understand the nature of those trade-offs, and I think you have to have some form of permanent body. As I say, the British Virgin Islands are on one, the Cayman Islands are on one, a cabinet committee, subcommittee. Well, why aren't the English regions?
I can't answer on behalf of the leaders of councils around the rest of the country, because they wouldn't contact me about Brexit. I'm sure that they would contact government, and so it's difficult for me to answer the question, because there is no reality. I think that that Andy said about the meeting in Cambridge being quite away from Manchester, and I hear him, having got up in the middle of the night to get here this morning. But I do think that it is important that the mayors are there. It is important that the mayors take advantage of that meeting with Suella to make sure that the opinion of the mayors is being heard. And as I alluded to earlier, I can't speak officially for the other areas in my region, but the economy around me is similar, and I do like to stand up for the East as much as possible. So whilst I can't officially shout out on behalf of Norfolk, Suffolk or Essex, etc., I will stand up for the local economy as much as I can, and I will utilise my position to do so.
I think there are a couple of points. I don't know what the LGA's position on Brexit is, nor what their level of engagement is, but the general local authority body, I imagine, is trying to rally itself around an LGA response, and I'm sure Lord Porter and others are looking to do that. That is an assumption on my part, but I would assume that would be the natural thing for them to do. I suppose one of the reasons that we're here today is that the Metro Mayor system is, along with the GLA and Sadiq in London, is a much smaller group of people, and so is more easily able to directly converse with us. I think the problem with one of the problems I foresee with why we haven't had more meetings, both at an official level, which was the COWGEX working group, and at a mayoral level, is when we come together as a collective, one of the things that was asked of us by the Brexit team was to have clear asks to talk about things. So the first meeting that took place was to talk about the replacement of European funding and a potential prosperity fund. So that was a clear thing that we could discuss, which we brought up with David Davis when we met him, and also the working group used that as a specific item that they would then drag in representatives from different government departments that were relevant to that topic. I think one of the biggest problems we've had so far as a grouping of Metro Mayors is that we've not come forward with a clear ask about what we want to then next discuss as a clear agenda item. And so in absence of that, what I've done is look at the Tees Valley and the wider North East and say, well, what are my clear asks of government, not just the Brexit team? And therefore, that's why we're getting better engagement, because we want to have a very clear discussion about the chemical sector. So they're very keen to say, OK, well, we'll set up a roundtable with you and NEPIC and Ian Wright, who's now the new chief exec of that, to look at what the chemical sector might look like. The first one was the Prosperity Fund, which they helped convene as well. And I think there's more work for us to do to be able to give a clear narrative about whether it's the north of England or whether it's the mayors as a collective, what we need to do to be able to facilitate what we want from government, rather than sitting down saying we just want more engagement. We need to say on what level and on what issues do we want engagement on, and what do we want our voice to be heard.
It's right that the Metro Mayors, the regional part of the debate is got right, but as in that you said earlier, the LGA has some role to play in this. When I go back and say I think the government missed a real opportunity, it is about the way that we work in this country and the way that central government relates back to local government in all its forms. So where Andy and Ben are both right in terms of where they're saying there's an attitudinal and cultural problem, I believe, in central government about working and relating to those in local government in the widest sphere, if I can call it that. And I just think they've just not got this right. And the reason why they've got, as much as we, this side of the table, might not have our asks right, it's clear in central government they haven't got their asks right. Now, in terms of what a local government can do some good, and some of the work we've done in London isn't just about London. So prior to the leaking of the government issue, we produced the independent report by Cambridge Economics, which wasn't just about London. We actually did it for the rest of the country, but we also, in London, went down to each individual London borough to enable boroughs to understand what the impact was likely to be in a way. So I think there's some issues about works and asks. There is an issue about facilitating. I think local government can facilitate people who are working at the sharp end to meet people like David Davis. And I think that's what the mayor's done and chosen to do at his meetings. He's not gone alone. He's taken people from various sectors. And the issue about the financial sector, I don't think it's a question of trade-offs. I think it's a question of understanding. I think one thing that we've found on Brexit is we've each understood our sectors differently now and the challenges they face. And the issue about the financial sector, if it catches a cold in London, it catches a cold in Manchester and in Birmingham and everywhere else. And so I think it's facilitating some of that work has to be seen. I think we can be more transparent as we ask government to be more transparent about the nature of that work. But I do think, on the whole, we've just missed, we haven't got a constitution, but a new settlement between us and government in terms of going forward to meet the challenges of the future. And we've not grasped that because of the complexities of Brexit.
Thank you. Mike.
I'll start with Mayor Burnham on this one. What are the consequences of insufficient dialogue between central government and local government? And moving forward, how can central government do things better? I mean, I'm pretty sure you've got a good idea of what you want to ask central government and press them on Brexit. So over to you first, Mayor Burnham.
Thank you very much. It's an important question because I think we're beginning to fear what that lack of engagement might mean the closer we get to the point of departure. You know, we are doing our own analysis. We have a Brexit monitor, so we track what it might mean for Greater Manchester. Obviously, when talk increases of no deal, that becomes quite worrying. Actually, you know that it's not just about what is said in negotiations; it's also how it is said, because you know if bridges are being burnt in Europe and we get closer to the figures, the regional impact assessment showed it gets more serious the more you are dependent on the EU for your exports. And as I said, Greater Manchester has a high number of exports. So you know we would be alongside the West Midlands, I think one of the areas that would be hardest hit, the northeast too. So it's too serious to kind of leave it in this place. I think it has to be, I think as Len Duval was just saying, move to a new footing so that we can kind of, at the moment we're not really able to kind of assess what is coming our way, and that's the really worrying thing about it. And you know that isn't a satisfactory position, is it, for me to, you know, if businesses came to me saying what is the latest thinking, where are they going on X issue or Y? Well, we can't really answer them because we've not been given access to those to those talks. You know, my analysis of this is Westminster is repeating in its handling of Brexit the same things that I would argue gave rise to Brexit. You know, a kind of Westminster-centric approach to life. You know, it's all about what happens there as opposed to what is happening out in the real world. My feeling is long, you know, that certain parts of the country felt abandoned by our political system, and there was a sense that the system of Westminster and Brussels combined worked better for some areas than it did for others. And I think that sentiment came through at the referendum. The problem is we're just repeating that mistake now in our handling of Brexit. So it would appear that some areas have a stronger voice in this process than others. And if we're not careful, that's going to kind of fuel the same sense of unfairness that created the referendum result in the first place. And that could become highly damaging to the country and a sense of one nation. I think that's why Len's talk of a new settlement is pretty urgent, I would say. And the other thing I would say is, you know, the government should be talking meaningfully with us about what can be taken back from Brussels and then devolved. Because if the plan is to take all this power back and then hoard it in Westminster, that again is going to be the wrong response to, I think, what the country was saying at the referendum 18 months ago. So the difficult thing is, you know, we're in the dark. And as I said, I mean, I don't even feel we were, I think we were, well, I don't want to, but we weren't told the facts when we met, because clearly there has been a regional impact assessment being done. At the very least, that should be shared with our team so that we can understand the assumptions that lie behind the figures that hit the public domain. Was it earlier this year or late last year? So, sorry, it sounds negative, but I'm afraid this isn't point scoring. It's just, you know, in the 18 months or so since the referendum or longer, despite repeated requests from Greater Manchester, there has been no serious arrangement put in place to ensure that our voice can be heard on an ongoing basis. And I take on board Ben Houchin's point about, well, it's up to you to get heard and you need to make the asks. Well, I don't think it can be like that, because therefore it's too random. It needs to be more structured so that every area of England, alongside the devolved administrations, has a permanent voice in this process.
I think that we're not going to year zero in 2019, and I don't see it as that way at all. Clearly, I think we'll be in Brexit negotiation probably for the next, well, forever, because there will always be things that need to be changed with the trade deal that is struck with the European Union. I'm confident that we will get a deal, by the way, Andy. I wasn't necessarily confident 6 or 8 months ago, but I am pretty confident now. And I believe that the deal that we get will be something that we can work seriously with. When it comes to individual areas, you know, my area is completely split. 70% of people in Cambridge and South Cambridgeshire voted to remain, and in the north it was exactly the opposite. Interestingly, both areas, as I mentioned earlier, reliant on immigrant trade. The difference that some are scientists and some are low-paid workers, and I've got to try and speak as a voice for both of those people. I've got to try and make sure that what's needed for my county gets across and is something that's heard by government, and I'm certainly trying to do that. The other thing that as mayors we can do is to try and spread our wings and spread our links internationally. Clearly there will be deals that are done after Brexit with other parts of the world, and I think it is up to mayors to begin to try and forge links with our international partners outside of Europe. Certainly life science and technology, which is a key industry for me. We already are. Cambridge already is the leader in Europe in life science and technology, and our partners internationally and our international competitors are mainly from the States and the Far East. And it's up to us to make sure that we're working alongside them to cross-pollinate and get new trade in and forge new trade links that potentially the government can come back on. I know, having been out to Washington and spoken to mayors from all over the US, that they are absolutely desperate to get a deal done with us, and they want to work more closely with us. So whilst this is a Brexit committee and whilst we're here to discuss Brexit, I don't think we can ignore the fact that there will be a deal done with Europe, in my opinion, and also post-2019 there will be new trade deals forged across the rest of the world, and it's up to government not just to continue Brexit negotiations past 2019, which of course they will, but to be absolutely ready to take on the opportunities that I can see, certainly for my patch, further afield than just the European Union. And I think it's an exciting opportunity. I'm not saying there aren't concerns around where we are, because clearly there are. It's a change to where we are. The status quo has changed. The people have spoken. I voted to remain, but the people spoke very clearly to leave. And the status quo has changed, so I feel very strongly, as Metro mayors, we have got the opportunity to spread our wings beyond just the European Union.
I think there are a few points. I think talking about devolution and Brexit within the same context is also quite a difficult thing, because devolution by definition is the devolution of powers from the centre to the regions in our case, and obviously there's a subsidiarity issue once we leave, that powers come back to the UK and it's where they should then lie. But then beyond that, if you ask yourself the question, well, what power should lie with the regions, my response to that is quite a parochial one. Then it depends on what my region requires. So I'm sure Andy or anybody on the panel, James and Len, will correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that we would want to have back that isn't necessarily a European issue is to devolve planning powers for major energy projects to the regions. You know, that affects me directly. I imagine it doesn't affect many other regions. And there will be powers that lie with the European Union at the moment that will come back that shouldn't then just be uniformly passed out, because actually there'll be some powers that I don't want, require or need. But conversely, that same power Andy or James or even Tim and Steve and the other Metro mayors might actually want. So we've got to make sure that it's a tailored package for the devolved areas, when I'm talking very parochially about the Metro mayors, about what we actually need and want. Because the needs of Manchester, Birmingham, London, Tees Valley, Newcastle are all extremely different. I would also say that as the Mayor of the Tees Valley, I like to think that I have a much better idea of what is important and what is going on in my area than central government. And to address the impact assessment, the North East was going to be the largest directly hit, according to the impact assessment, of a reduced growth of 16% over a 15-year period. Now, putting to one side the fact that the people that put those impact assessments together can't get anything right 6 months out, never mind 15 years out, there's an issue that those impact assessments didn't take into account some quite serious issues. So, for example, we have a project that, while it is in North Yorkshire, Sirius Minerals, which is a £5 billion project, likely one of the largest private sector investments in the whole of Europe right now from an Australian mining company, building a deep mine in Whitby, just outside of Whitby, but most of the economic benefit will be felt in Teesport because there's going to be a 27-kilometre tunnel that comes through Teesport. That's where it's going to be generated. There's going to be lots of factories, manufacturing, starch production, etc., that comes out there. Now, those impact assessments don't take that into account. And while I must say this is an unverified stat, the stat that I have seen that came out of Sirius is that once that's up and running, that could add up to more than 20% of GDP to the Tees Valley economy. Now, those impact assessments don't take that into account. We've also got the first mayoral development corporation to be established outside of London on the South Tees Development Corporation site, which covers the old steelworks site. We are potentially looking, just as a first phase, we're talking 5, maximum 6 individual projects over the next 5 years to be announced of more than £10 billion worth of private sector investment. Those impact assessments, again, do not take that into account. So I think we've got to take with a pinch of salt what those impact assessments say. We've got to actually look sometimes quite parochially and say, actually, we know what's going to happen in our area and we should be educating central government about the private investment that's coming, and then tailor the needs of the Tees Valley to what we want to see out of Brexit. But whatever happens in Brexit, there is that ongoing dialogue with government about further devolution. So it's not a single stage, it's a multi-stage approach, in my opinion, of how those powers not just come back from Brussels, but then the process of how they get handed back to the regions, in what form and in what timeline.
I'm not sure that we should just ignore impact assessment studies, albeit the history of them have been, depending on your viewpoint, questionable. They're there to guide, and then I think you can replace from exciting times for the future with challenging times for our communities, and I think I come from that. If we get it wrong, so in London, in terms of if the government fails to listen, we've got 1 million EU citizens. We thought we had a sensible arrangement, and then someone said something else in government that's thrown it up a little bit. We know there will be some sensible arrangement, but the impact of a number of those leaving, both for the public and private sector, is pretty challenging. To replace those, then we need a skills agenda and the tools to do that. That can't be done in by central government alone. We need to think of who are the right people to do that. And then I think we need further clarity around the shared prosperity fund or whatever replacements there are, because I think we really do. I mean, if ever there was an ask from local government strategic mayors, I think the strategic mayors have got to be in a position to be the deliverers of that, like London is for ERDF and ESF there. That's why we need a relationship. But we do need to bring the other local government players back into that conversation. And again, it can't be government to decide that grant regime alone, because it hits a number of buttons and pushes. Remembering both the EU grants are the only grants that are really our business support grants, and the third sector in training and support to small businesses is quite a key issue. And then I think we need some sort, and I think Andy said it earlier on, whatever happens in this Brexit world, some sensible transitional arrangement to enable our businesses to continue trading until we understand what those deals are. And I think we know they're complicated and they take time, but if we're speaking up for our communities, not just residential, but our business communities, is to make sure that we have a sensible arrangement around that. For us, and I do think for the country, for UK PLC, you need some reassurance about the financial sector in terms of the tax bucks it delivers to the national economy, but you have to have some sensible arrangements on that. That's not arguing for some offshore, let's go down to the lowest common denominator, that's how we're going to beat the markets, but we need some sensible conversation about the financial services back into the EU and what does that mean. And lastly, which is always the missing bit, but probably just as important for local government at its various levels, is security arrangements. We forget that, and it's quite an important bit. Some work has been done in the House of Lords. Your colleagues have done that work, which I think is something we should all be pressing for. And actually, I can't see why it's part of the deal. It shouldn't be, because it makes sense. And it's not just about counter-terrorism. It's about policing serious crime across boundaries. And we need to get that bit right. And if we get all those wrong in London, then actually we're in a very difficult situation. And I suspect that will rebound across the rest of the regions. Now, in all those studies that have been done, London has some resilience and comes out, will cope with, if on the worst case scenarios, a lot better than other regions. But there's still an impact in terms of some of our sectors that we need to rise to the challenge and think about how do we try and minimise those issues.
Mike, did you want to come back or no? No. Okay. In which case, Mary, you had a supplementary question.
Should you, just a year out now from the end of the negotiations, be banging on the door of Whitehall to get this engagement that you need?
Yes, probably, and we are, Mary, but we're hoping you might too. The committee might do that. I think, I don't want to sound overly negative this morning, but the point is this is of enormous significance, isn't it, for every single resident of Greater Manchester. So we can't just work in the old way where we wait to hear from the powers that be down in Westminster. We have to be heard now, and not just heard properly and allowed to understand some of the difficult trade-offs, and as I said before. So yes, we have done that, but I think obviously any support in doing that. I mean, Len raised the Shared Prosperity Fund. I mean, that's a good example. Greater Manchester currently gets around £50 million a year from that, and obviously that then gets matched either via private sources or government nationally will match that funding. So it turns into 100 million a year. We need to know what is the future of that funding. What is the Shared Prosperity Fund? What level of flexibility will we have over it? And I guess, we've missed a spring statement. Well, the spring statement's come and gone. So is it now the budget when that will be confirmed? Well, at the latest, I would say, because, we really need to know what the arrangements are so we can begin to make some meaningful plans. So, yeah, it couldn't be more urgent now. And, it's great that the minister has offered us a meeting in Cambridge, but it doesn't feel good enough to me. There's meetings here and there. It really does need to move to a very different basis on which these things are now being discussed. And actually, I think partly what that committee should do is pick up precisely the point that Ben Houchin just made. Around where is there scope for further devolution? I feel actually the answer to Brexit is much further and faster and deeper devolution across the country, so that areas can become more self-sufficient, can take more decisions for themselves, and not always beholden to a national policy that doesn't work for them. This brings me to a real frustration that I feel at the moment. Whenever we try and engage on issues that we feel are now urgent, such as skills, because businesses are saying, well, Brexit may have an impact on our workforce. We need to plan for that, and we need to get better at bringing people through the kind of skills pipeline so that we're not left with a shortage. What do we hear whenever we try and engage with government? There's this terrible phrase that there's no bandwidth for anything but Brexit. So that's a real problem, a real problem. Westminster's kind of saying Brexit's so much of a preoccupation, we can't make progress on domestic policy in the way that we normally would. But then they're not freeing us up to do something on those issues. So, for instance, the apprenticeship levy, is having trouble bedding down. There's quite a big underspend in some of that money. We've asked for it to be devolved so that we can use it and begin to work with our colleges to address some of these issues. And yet, the DFE doesn't seem to sort of share our sense of urgency. So, it's both the actual negotiations, but it's also engagement with the government on what comes after and what powers are we going to have to do more for ourselves. Where's the funding coming from in terms of the Shared Prosperity Fund? It's that really broad waterfront that we're still in the dark, I would say, about a lot of it.
Liz.
Thanks. I wanted to ask again about the dialogue issue. We talked in the last question about there's a kind of argument about whether we push or whether we pull in dialogue with the government. So the consequences of not having that kind of consistent dialogue are presumably that we don't know what the government is thinking and the government doesn't know what you're thinking, although I think what you're saying is that actually we're making the arguments. Is that a big disadvantage in this situation?
As I said earlier, I have been able to put across the concerns of businesses that have come to me. I have had that contact. Yes, there could always have been more, but I do feel that I've been listened to. I feel that government have an understanding of the areas that I have raised awareness and the issues that are being faced by businesses in my patch. So I don't think it's a deaf ear. Obviously, my experience is slightly different to Andy. I do think potentially we could have had more. And, having our first meeting with a government minister as mayors coming up, this probably could have been done sooner, and I think it should have been. But as I said earlier, I have been able to make those points and those contacts. It is imperative when it comes to the workforce that we have, that we have a seasonal workers contract, that there is something available for us. That's something that used to happen. Most of the seasonal workers that came over to work certainly were doing that for many years before Schengen arrived and there was free movement. Certainly we have to have a visa system for scientists to allow them to move around as freely as possible. And these are representations that I've made to government and government understand. Sometimes these things are, even if we put the right schemes in place, other issues affect whether or not people come to the UK to work. And certainly seasonal workers or immigrant labour for agricultural industry, there's been a drop-off on how many are here over the last year or so. And that's not been because, although it's been reported as this, it's not because of insecurities over Brexit. It's because the pound dropped against the euro and they could make more money elsewhere. Clearly, if our economy is strong and the pound is high, then as is going the other direction now, then it does make a difference. So it's not always Brexit to blame for everything. There are other issues around this. So I think it is up to the mayors to put themselves forward. I expect very much that we all are anyway, but I think we also have to utilise this contact that we're coming up and make sure that we underline our points.
If I can just follow up on that point. Presumably, as well as you needing to tell the government about your concerns, you need to hear what the government is discussing and planning so that you can receive that and make your plans accordingly as well.
Yes, although they're in negotiation. I wouldn't expect the government to give, the government's negotiations. There's four of us sitting at the table here. Each of us has made different points that are pertinent to our patch. So the government could send me everything and it would only be a small amount that would be pertinent to me. So I think, yes, to a certain extent, but I do think the government have got a job to do. And you can't have 100 people in a room when you're making negotiations. You have to have a strict and strong line, and you have to be strong on that, and you have to make sure your position is right. Government are clearly aware of where our strengths lie as an economy, and they're clearly aware of where we feel we have to be. What we've got here is not, in my view, is not a government who don't want to do a high-quality deal with Europe. We've got a European Union that's frightened, very frightened, of getting a good deal for the UK because of the impact it may have on other countries around Europe. And this is the biggest risk here. So because the UK has left, will the UK be the only country that leaves the EU? Well, in my opinion, it probably won't be. But that is dependent on the deal that the UK gets. And if the UK gets an exceptional deal, that weakens the European Union as it stands.
Sorry, Andy, if I may, I agree with Andy that I personally believe that the The long-term solution to all of this is further devolution. I think devolution, being an overly centralised country, is never a good thing. But then the question of engagement on, you know, what should we be doing to engage with government? Well, it depends on what level. So again, to use the parochial answer is, you know, do I need to convene a meeting of all local authorities or metro mayors to talk about the chemical industry? Well, no, that's specific to my area, as there will be specifics to other people's areas that we should be engaging with government on. There is the next level up, which I think there are things that are pertinent to the north of England, which are not necessarily pertinent or as heavily felt elsewhere. And I think one of the things that we found that we all agreed on, and actually it's surprising how much Andy, Steve and I agree on many important things for the north of England, was the Prosperity Fund. And we all signed a joint letter on the 9th of November to government stating that we needed a prosperity fund and that we actually called for full replacement of those funds that we currently get from the European Union for a transition period of 15 years. In my area, it benefits to the tune of £25 million a year. So there are things on a northern level that we should caucus around and deliver. And then there's things on a national level, which is the skills agenda, of which all of the mayors signed a joint letter informing government that our position was that we needed to make sure that for good quality skills, people needed to be able to access across the world our world-class universities and encourage people to continue to come here as well. So it's about a degree of level at where do you need to caucus at. My position is, and it's a very parochial one, but we are the regional leaders of our areas, and it's for us to make the case to go to government and say this is what is affecting my area, whether that's specifically the Tees Valley or the north of England, and we can do that on a joint basis. But it's for us to tell the government what we want. And I think this is the whole point of devolution. We should be telling the government what we want rather than them coming to us saying, oh, by the way, we're doing this. And we can influence that. And I'm finding certainly in the Tees Valley and with the things we've done with Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham on the Prosperity Fund, we are starting to see that. So, for example, the letter that went in on the 9th about the Prosperity Fund, very shortly thereafter we got contacted by DEXU, who then arranged a meeting which led to the first meeting of officials to talk about what that Prosperity Fund might look like. So when we do make a joint ask, we get listened to. The question I have is, and I suppose it's one that Andy and Steve and I need to go away for the north of England, and all mayors need to go away as a collective and say, where are the commonalities that we can write to government and say, this is important to us? Because on the evidence of it, when we've done that, we've had strong engagement.
Yeah, just to build on that point, I mean, you know, partly this is up to us to articulate very clearly what we want, and actually just something I could have said in response to Mary. We are looking at what we're calling a convention of the North later this year, alongside the Great Exhibition of the North, bringing together not just the mayors but political leaders and business leaders from all parts of the north of England, because we kind of feel we're at a critical juncture actually in terms of there are big decisions being made this year that will have a bearing on the northern economy for the rest of this century, not just on Brexit but on transport investment as well. The final decisions on HS2 and the west-east rail system, Northern Powers Rail, Crossrail for the North, it goes by different names, but you know these are massive decisions and we have to get them right, and it's why we've spoken about bringing the North together so that we can speak with one voice on Brexit, on transport, on skills, and actually on a call for more devolution. And maybe that will help, you know, really give that profile to our call that I think you were touching on before, Mary. I think what this is flushing out, though, is the slightly unsatisfactory nature of our constitutional settlement at the moment. And Len, again, was right to talk about this. You know, different parts of the country have differential access into the Whitehall system. The more established areas that have devolution, London, Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, clearly they've got well worked out arrangements for how they engage with government. The metro mayors are beginning to develop them, although they're not there yet, and other parts of the country have nothing at all. I think it's really important that this is dealt with very quickly. Otherwise, as I say, it's going to really kind of frustrate people that some areas get heard and others don't. And I think this needs to be corrected sooner rather than later. Otherwise, it could leave a kind of lingering sense of unfairness about the Brexit deal, and that would be highly damaging. Just one last point. I mean, I hear what James and Ben are saying. I agree with a large part of it. But the trouble I've got is, you know, if the government was speaking with one voice, it wouldn't be so bad. But they're not. You'll get a kind of more positive message from the Chancellor than you do from the Foreign Secretary or the Brexit Secretary. And I certainly picked up alarm from businesses the more that rhetoric was being ramped up at times last year towards a no-deal position. You know, that is a very, very worrying scenario for a lot of businesses here. And it's the feeling that there's a kind of bit of game playing going on, or, you know, point scoring, or the rerunning of the referendum. And I think, to answer your question, Liz, if those ministers were regularly confronted with this is how your statements feel to people out there trying to carry on doing business with Europe, I think it might make them think twice before they make some of those statements. And I think it's the absence of that conduit of information coming back to them that possibly makes them make bolder or more provocative statements than they sort of realistically should be doing, given the seriousness of these issues for the businesses that we represent.
Sorry, Len, could you mind if I just jump in? I think this actually really goes to the heart of what we're talking about here. The Andy's point, which is very interesting, is that we've also got to be careful what we wish for. So devolution back to the regions and singing with a single voice of what we want, for example, for the north of England, is quite an interesting thing. And I think the Tees Valley is a good working example of this, because for a lot of years, under the old RDA, and we had one northeast in Newcastle, the Tees Valley got ignored substantially. We got very little funding. It was very Newcastle-centric. And one of the reasons we actually have a devolution deal is because the leaders in the south of the region realised that this was their opportunity to take hold and take control of their own destiny. And so if we're not too careful, if we caucus too much on a regional level or even a subnational level, like, you know, the northern region, one of the things that I know that local leaders and residents in my area will be very concerned, and this goes as it's a testament to Manchester and the success of it, that we'll be replacing a centralist London with Manchester, and a lot of the decision making will be made in the northwest, whereas actually we've got, I think, a very good economic, and we've got an economic area and a community area in the Tees Valley that makes sense, and where it makes sense to do so, we will work on a regional and a subnational and a national level with each other. But to try and replace central government with another centralist bureaucracy that then means that the Tees Valley or Newcastle or Leeds or Bradford or whoever it might be has a lesser voice than it does actually now, we've got to be very careful about the balance of where power and responsibility actually lies.
And that's an interesting point, because I think that's one about boundaries, isn't it? And I think on the old RDA boundaries they were, I think, from my point of view, very good in what they were trying to do, but maybe the boundaries were slightly wrong about what their regional focus was. I think just in terms of adding a year, because I'll combine the two, a year out, I think the expectation from business people, politicians, people on the ground at the sharp end would expect further progress and the direction of travel that we understand. So if I go back to the point about EU citizens, we think we're on the cusp of doing that. We've stopped talking about regional visas and whatnot in London, because we think there's going to be a national scheme that's going to work and be simple in terms of how it's going to be implemented, and everybody knows where they stand. As I've said, we've got over a million EU people. They've not just come here yesterday. They've been established in London for a number of years. We've had some very good scrutiny meetings on that. In terms of the Prosperity Fund, and I think it's important, because part of the conversation that needs to be had with central government is we also lose what we've had the benefit in London of. So the European Investment Bank, so some of the projects it's funded in the past are just to paint you pictures. So we borrowed from them at favourable rates, commercial rates as well, 1.4 billion towards station upgrades, 600 million towards Crossrail 1, 435 million towards the expansion of the London Overground service, which, if anyone follows the debate in the South East, was a new way of providing a metro service for London and outside London, exposing the weakness of the current franchise system. 623 million towards the extension of the Northern Line. That's going to be lost. And in terms of some of those plans, government as beholden is not just got to talk about the Prosperity Fund, but think about where else are we going to access that money, and how are they going to enable those regional players to be able to deliver some of that infrastructure that's quite needed. And I think what was quite important, we've only touched on it, the LEP infrastructure is going to be very important. And again, you know, I'm not suggesting, you know, in the new settlement, you would have thought that the government might just want to review about what LEPs had. We received evidence from Michael Heseltine because we thought actually Michael Heseltine, in terms of his experience of introducing new grant regimes from the very early single regeneration city challenge all the way through, then we had Labour introducing EFIMS, we thought it'd be worth getting him through. And some of these aspects of regionalism is still not picked up by central government and acknowledged, and actually might help us in facing some of the challenges of the future. And it is just about a question of those. One thing is certain, it's not just about who is in control and devolution, because I think devolution says you've really got to strengthen some of your partnership working back at base. So, you know, if I can be, I'm not a voice for local government here, is just remembering the metro mayors, and I know it's different, slightly different in Manchester, is making sure that partnership working, whether it's in the business sector or in local government, is very stable and can be built upon to deliver. Because I don't think government actually, I don't think it values some of these institutions in the way that it should. Because if it did, we wouldn't be discussing how we talk to each other, even though these are complex negotiations and what the answers are. And that's part of why I say the attitudinal, cultural aspect of government. And I say this, I've got to say this, even though I'm a Labour politician, I got a feeling, being like that, we're Labour in government, so it's not a party political point I'm making. There's a problem about that future relationship. Going back to Andy's point, why I think there needs to be a new settlement and new thinking, and definitely more of the same isn't going to work. Skills in particular. If we carry on with the skills agenda that we're doing now, our lack of skills and investment in skills, then we're never going to meet some of the gaps that we face. And that's got to be number one ask on the devolution agenda. I think strategic mayors are best placed to oversee that, working with other partners in delivering that.
Thank you. Jo.
Okay, you've all alluded to the funding streams that come from the EU. I'd just like to go into that a little bit further. How important are these to each city that you represent?
Well, the north of the county, north of my area, is where we have seen the Prosperity Fund, particularly in areas around Fenham, where there's high employment with very low wages, and there's in-work poverty and poverty in those areas. The problem has been that the funding from the EU has not really changed it. So where the money has been sent from the EU, the direction it's been put in, the way that it's been implemented, we haven't seen a sea change at all. So in actual fact, that money has not changed the fact that people in remote rural areas are still struggling, some of them, and they're still facing the same problems they were before significant millions of pounds were invested into those regions. So I think certainly change in the way that Prosperity Fund is invested, and certainly going through the devolved mayors, would be a huge improvement. A lot of the time the money was given and it had to be spent very quickly, and it led to short-term thinking and led to bad decision making, as I said, and it hasn't actually solved the problem at all. So I think that there is an opportunity now to do things different because of devolution. We've heard the other speakers mention of how the government must take advantage of the devolved power that they've allowed, the 6 new metro mayors. That's the government's decision to do so. So I'll take a little bit of a different view to Len. I'll agree with him that local government has struggled under different colours of government over the years, but I do feel for the first time that central government can see that there's too much centralisation, and they can see that investment in devolving power to metro mayors and combined authorities is a way forward. I think that Brexit is going to be a test of that, and absolutely I believe that they should be going further, and it's up to us when we go for deal 2, deal 3, deal 4, to make sure that we pressure government to get more devolved power, to allow us to have more control and more investment over longer periods into our particular areas.
Can I just clarify on the point? So do you think it's not been well spent, or it's not gone where it should be because it has been centralised?
I think yes. I think both. Absolutely. And I think that it encouraged too much short-term thinking, and certainly the proof of the pudding is there in that there is still rural poverty. There is still a disconnect. There's still an issue where people feel that society has left them behind. So we all believe pretty much the same when it comes to skills, with education. All of these areas can be devolved from central government. I mean, and then you can begin to make a real difference. Spending money, throwing money on top of things is never really the problem. You've got to get to the source of the problem. Certainly the issue in my patch is around people being disconnected because they're not fitting into the education system and they're not fitting into the 5 A to C's and getting into university, and investing through schools and through the skills agenda and giving them more opportunity in life. Then we can begin to lift people out of the poverty that they're in my patch. It will be completely different in other people's patches. And this is why devolution is so important. I moved away slightly with Brexit, but it is important that government realise the ability they have to make significant improvements to people's opportunities in life through devolution, and using Brexit as a tool to do that. Because I can put forward an education policy and a skills policy that's suitable for my county. Exactly the same policy would not necessarily be suitable for Andy's patch, but he could clearly do the same. And I think government have really got to take advantage. Of course, the other thing for government is they can blame us if things go wrong and take credit if things go right, which they're pretty good at anyway. So, but my, our job as mayors is to actually to get our hands dirty and to try and really change generational problems. And I think we can do that. I just really want to get on with it, to be honest with you. But we are being held up by DFE, and it is a massive issue. But there will be opportunities in the future where there is funding that's coming into our patches that we could spend in a better way than it has been spent in the past.
I think it's the right question to ask, Joe, because a sense of unfairness about the way funding is allocated in this country, I think, was one of the contributory factors to Brexit. So your constituency, obviously, which I know well, like many industrial communities, saw its big industry go in the 80s and the 90s. There was no meaningful help from the Westminster government to help with the transition from the old economy to a new one. They were basically left to cope on their own. And then when Europe expanded to the east, other social issues then arose. No wonder they felt no one was listening to them, really. And no wonder, in my view, there was a high leave vote in those areas, because the system would not appear to have worked for them. So I think this has got to be a moment where the question of funding and fairness about funding, I think we were all listening quite enviously when Len was reeling off some of those figures that we just heard. It's a moment, I think, through the shared prosperity fund, maybe that shared word at the start of it. How about really demonstrate that as a UK from here on in, we are going to both devolve as much as possible, but give fairness in terms of the amount of money that's at the disposal of different regions. So, to answer your question, there's two separate issues on Europe, ESF and ERDF. So we get about 50 million a year from that, and as I say, it's matched, so it's around about 100 million. In terms of the European Investment Bank, which is a separate facility, we had 450 million for Metrolink Phase 3, and another 150 million borrowing facility, which amongst other things helped fund the Lee-guided busway. You'll be pleased to know. So, to be honest, what I would say, Chair, is over the years, areas that have kind of felt a sense of unfairness in terms of central government funding, have used European funding to get access to funding in a way that we often don't get through the UK system. And I think, as we kind of enter this new phase, the moment has got to be now for the government to say, look, let's get this whole question about the fairness of resourcing and regional distribution of it. Let's get it on a much better, more transparent footing than it's been in the past. Let's not use the Treasury test, which is about GVA when it comes to approving transport projects or not, which projects will add most value to the economy. We need a fairer test that balances economic gain alongside social gain. Otherwise, large areas of the north will continue to lose out. There are big decisions looming on transport investment, as I said. Len will have aspirations around Crossrail too. We have our aspirations around Northern Powerhouse Rail. If the government can fund both together, well, great. But if they can't, I think there needs to be a sense that we're responding to the challenge of Brexit by giving those areas that most need the investment in their infrastructure the chance to build that infrastructure and face up to what Brexit means. And the time is now to do all of that.
When it comes to European structural funds, then the Tees Valley is the largest, second largest recipient per head of population in the country, which equates to about £245 per head. And it's 170 million between the 2014-2020 spending round, so it's significant. And I think on that basis, there is an ability for government to get a very quick win on helping to rebalance the economy and devolution by converting the money that, in effect, we're sending to Brussels that comes back with strings and bells and whistles attached to give it to us in relation to the Shared Prosperity Fund. And that can easily come into our single spending pot from the devolved areas, so it increases our gain share that we get on an annual basis, and then ultimately it's for the government of the day to decide whether they want to increase that, maintain it, or reduce it down. But I suppose that's democracy, and it's the increase in power that we'd have over having control completely over our own funds. Because one of the big problems we have, even with the money that we do get, which is substantial, is that it does come with so many strings attached, and by definition it then distorts the local economy because you can only use it on certain things. Whereas if it was part of our single pot with in effect zero strings attached, then it would be for the directly elected cabinet and mayors to decide what needs to be done with it. And let's also be clear here, there's already an insurance framework in place with Treasury and DCLG in relation to how we spend our single pot. So it's not as if the government and civil servants would have to create a new framework for this. It would be as part of the assurance framework to make sure it was properly spent, and that there were some checks and balances from central government to make sure that there wasn't some sort of radical mayor wanting to spend all their money on something ridiculous. So the mechanism for it is there for it to be devolved directly. In effect, it's like leaving and maintaining alignment initially, and then it's for the government of the day to stand on a manifesto to decide whether they want to increase funding to the regions via these single pots, keep them the same or reduce them. But I think it's a quick win to be able to deliver those directly into the regions, make sure they're replaced. It gives us more certainty that those monies are going to be there in the next spending round, which makes us better able to forward plan. And that's not just on business startup and investment. The skills agenda is obviously a key one to that as well, and it helps us longer term plan for that.
Can I just follow up on that? So has there been adequate dialogue or discussions with regards to how this is going to work? Or, I mean, you're saying there's an existing framework that exists. Going forward into, say, the Shared Prosperity Fund, has there been dialogue onto how that will work?
So, yeah, the existing framework is part of, obviously, the devolution deal, that the single pot and assurance framework is there to monitor that we're spending our money in an appropriate manner, for want of a better phrase. So the mechanism is there for that money to come straight across. That was the reason for the letter that Andy Burnham, Steve Rotherham and I sent on the 9th. That was the reason for the officials meeting to talk through that detail. And we continue to follow up and put pressure on central government to find out the detail of what that will look like. But there hasn't been clarity as yet as to what that will exactly look like. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether there is a commitment as yet to devolve those funds at the current level into the single pot where there are devolved regions. But that is obviously what I know that we've been asking for in the north of England.
And obviously the clarity around that, we shouldn't be talking about waiting to hear from government. They should be actually sitting alongside us and co-designing it to meet the needs in terms of where we are in the regions. If we get this terribly wrong in some of this infrastructure, and there's an element, and I can see where government is coming from. I suspect a number of government departments all think it's their money and for their schemes. And one of the particular things that I have is the third sector around training at all level. So it's training back into business, it's training for people for World of Work, ESF. If that falls by the board because that department isn't sufficiently banging the table and saying, well, we'd like a piece for that, then that will go off because transport will pick it up, because that will be seen that we don't have to provide that, and this single pot and the flexibility around that. So I think we need some greater clarity from government, but we also need to be put in, not just in consultation, but of co-designing and be very clear of what we want these funds to do, because I don't think they replace some of the big asks. ERDF probably does, but not ESF. And I'm worried about that infrastructure of the voluntary stroke third sector in delivery of that. Do we value it? Do we do that? People have mixed views about it. But in terms of delivering value for money on some skills projects, they certainly carry their weight better than some statutory organisations. So I'm a pluralist in the sense of a number of organisations, but we ought to nurture this sector. If not, it's going to go and it will be hard to replace. It really is about clarity about what we want to see that fund deliver and what's the bits we need to do.
So can I just say on that again, the position that I kind of take on this as part of devolution is that just give us the money, and then whether, you know, Len, you want to spend it on skills or transport, or it's up to the directly elected people who have the money to be able to decide on the framework based on in their local area of what they want. Because the last thing I would want to see is the money to come back into central government. And as I understand it, the people who are looking at potentially developing the framework are the same people that in effect manage the European funds and therefore attach the same conditions and the same strings to the regions, which means it's not really devolution because it's a very centralised pot of money. And in effect, all we do is become an intermediary body for, you know, London administered funds rather than European administered funds.
I mean, I think, you know, look, I agree with that, but to say that government's just going to give a sum of money over and say over to you, Metro Mayors, to do as you want, isn't really there. If we go back to the mission, in terms of some of the challenges we face on Brexit, I'd see an element of that funding has to be delivered for skills or not, because we can't go back to what we've had over the last 40 years of under skills investment. You know, we've been driven by that. And if one of the key issues was migration, was a fear of migration in some areas, and they voted that way, then you need to address that skill. So how do you position, unfortunate term, but the homegrown to take advantage of the smaller opportunities that I believe will arise from Brexit if we're going to fill that issue? You know, we've seen the control, you know, the value of the pound is the only controlling mechanism on migration at the moment. It's not government policy, let's be honest about it, the value of the pound in our pocket. So in that sense, if there is a mass exodus on some sectors, how do we fill that gap? You've got to have an element, and if you say skills is one of the key bits, then part of that fund will go on skills, regardless of the region, because it's a UK problem. It's not just a problem down in London, and I suspect it's there in your region. So I think that's the conversation that we've got to get into and understand that. And grant regimes of the past have never really given it all over to you to decide where you want for the needs of your community. Laudable as it may be, that's not the case. That central government of whatever party just doesn't do that.
I think...
Sorry,
sorry,
quickly.
I
I just want to just echo what you've just been hearing, and I wouldn't want the committee to leave today without having got over to you the urgency of this skills issue. When we met in Birmingham as Metro Mayors recently, with Andy Street convening, if you'd close your eyes, you wouldn't know which was the Conservative and which was the Labour Mayor speaking.
If I may just interject, yeah. we've got some questions on workforce issues coming up, which allows you to talk about the skills agenda. If we could just stick to final comments on funding, and then I think Joe's got some follow-up questions, and then we'll move on to talk about
well, I'll say that later
skills
then,
in a second.
Just very briefly on the funding. When we were elected as Metro Mayors, business rate retention was on the agenda. It seems to have gone off the agenda, and I think business rate retention would put us in a very strong position as individual mayors, rather than the grant funding from the EU or other grant funding. It's allowing us then to make the changes and make the differences where we need to, rather than have restricted grants. And I think that would be, post-Brexit, absolutely the right way for us to go.
One last one. So the government has promised to make £3 billion available to help with Brexit contingency. Have you been able to access any of this money as you plan for Brexit?
No. None of this funding, to my knowledge, has been allocated at either a Greater Manchester level or to any of our 10 councils. And also, back to the point that they're not sharing some of the planning analysis that's coming out as a result of the three, so we're not getting either. And I think, again, that's something that the committee should take a look at, but no is the answer.
In fact, we understand it's only been allocated to central government departments, and that's why it's even more important we need to understand what they're spending it on. And I've got to say, whatever the the ministry is, whatever they call themselves this week for local government, they've not been allocated any to date. It's maybe a question that this committee might wish to ask of them, to say why are they not put in bids, because I think there are a whole number of areas where they should be going into this pot, where they could make a valid case to say that their responsibilities deserve a bit here. I mean, look, you know, construction industries, if we lose some of the migrant labour on that, why isn't local government and construction still there? What are they doing? Are they working with their partners in business? Discuss.
Yes, it's on this question of the European funds. You've all described, I think, Mr. Palmer, you described in some detail why the strings attached to it don't necessarily represent long-term interests. And you've all talked about devolving that money, although we don't know what the Shared Prosperity Fund looks like. Are you confident that there will be extra money devolved in place of these European funds for you to meet the needs of your communities?
I think so. I have to say, in my experience in the almost 1 year of being a mayor, government have provided us with funds that we haven't had as a region before. I did just allude to and mention business rate retention, and I think that would be a very clear way for government to give the freedom to the Metro mayors to deliver on agendas in their patch, and it would certainly be a significant amount of money that we could invest over the long term to improve our areas of deprivation. Interestingly, the money clearly hasn't had the effect it was meant to have, because the areas, our most deprived areas, are the ones who voted most strongly to leave the European Union. So I think that there's obviously scope for us to do things better and look at things over a longer term. But as I said, I will be lobbying for the business rate retention. I think that's key to us, and it will make a massive difference.
Obviously, there's a lot of money to be found for the NHS first, isn't there, from the savings? And you know, so no, I'm not as confident as James said. Specifically, I've got my worry would be that the government says, well, what's ERDF and ESF at the moment? Oh, it's 50 million a year for Greater Manchester. Right, we'll give Greater Manchester 50 million a year. Well, at the moment, that would take out their contributions that are often made matching ERDF and ESF. So that has to be watched, you know. So it needs to be the same level, at least the same level of spending that arises from the existence of those European funds, rather than the precise price tag of the European funds themselves. I think if you see that point, and then there is that question of the lending facility that comes through the European Investment Bank. Are they going to negotiate for us to continue to have access, or is there no? You know, what is the nature of those arrangements? Because we are currently looking at another lending facility with them with regard to the extension of Metrolink into Trafford. So, you know, we need to know on all of those fronts. But I think there's a risk that we may see a bit of sleight of hand here, and you know, in saying that they are matching ERDF and ESF, actually they're not, because it's only half of what we actually get from those sources.
I'd be very surprised if there wasn't. Very, very early on, I think only a few weeks after the election, the mayors were invited to London to meet with all the permanent secretaries, and one of the things that came up even then was the Shared Prosperity Fund. And the response that we got back is that they are looking at it, and there is a model that the response we got back was extremely positive. Like I say, in the devolved areas, it would be very easy to administer through the current assurance framework because it's already established in there. So the monies, we just need to keep an eye on, as Andy Burnham says, that the monies flow through into the framework. But all of the indications we've had so far is that there will be a prosperity fund. The big question that we don't have the answer to, and maybe government are not in a position as yet to give us the answer, is on the amount that each of us will get as a result.
Before we move on to workforce issues, can I just press James Palmer and Ben Huchan a little bit on that issue? You've variously talked about business rate retention, about money coming back from the EU. So far from the government, we've seen funding allocated in the autumn budget and in the spring statement for Brexit contingency, government expenditure for Brexit contingency. And the Chancellor's own forecast last week was of very, very flat levels of growth overall. When you consider all of the funding that your regions receive from and your cities receive from the EU at the moment in terms of your research funding into Cambridge institutions, infrastructure investment in total, are you really confident? And if so, where does the evidence come from that the funding that you currently receive will be replaced to the benefit of your area? I mean, I get the optimism, but where is the evidence for that? Because the committee, I don't think, has received evidence to support what you're saying. If you could just respond briefly.
In the budget, the government put an extra £300 million into research, available research fund for Cambridge. And conversations that I've had with government would indicate to me that they're certainly willing to continue to invest into life science and technology in our patch. Clearly, it's one of the key points of the industrial strategy, and I think the government can understand entirely that what Cambridge currently brings to the economy and what Cambridge will bring to the economy post-Brexit, and the opportunities for Cambridge to grow exponentially from where it is now, and consequently for other science and technology hubs that are relatively close to it to do so. So I think the evidence is there in the budget. It's been clear, and it's been obvious that they've put the funding forward. I think the evidence is there as well in the commitment that government have given in that particular area. So yes, my confidence is based on conversations I'm having with government. It's based by the evidence of the budget, and it's based by the strength of our economy and the ability of our particular part of the country to lead the UK economy post-2019.
Okay, so no, the straight answer is that we haven't had a written report. We haven't had any black and white evidence of it, but multiple discussions with David Davis, Steve Baker, Sajid Javid and other ministers within DCLG, including the Permanent Secretary at DCLG. The noises are more than optimistic. It's not really, I think, whether we're going to have a prosperity fund, but really how it's structured and how much we therefore get. And that is still the unknown.
James, sorry, I'm just going to come back on something that you said there, because obviously you were talking about the industrial strategy and the autumn budget. And isn't there a worry or a concern that we are mixing the two, if you like? The prosperity fund is something separate. The industrial strategy, again, has to be dealt separately.
Being very clear on the £300 million in the budget for Cambridge, that was separate to the prosperity fund, but what it showed was a clear commitment from government to the sector that's so strong in our particular area. So when I talked in detail about prosperity fund, it was really about the areas in the north of the county that needed the investment because of the low wage economy and the deprivation there. So I was trying to make a very clear difference between what government put forward in the budget and the support that government is showing to the life science sector, the technology centre, the genomics that's around in the south of the county, which the government have got confidence in and are obviously very happy to, at the moment, to invest in.
So if I can just clarify my remark, I thought I was slightly wrong. In our draft second devolution deal for the Tees Valley, there is reference to the shared prosperity fund within that. And the specific second devolution ask is about working with DCLG and central government about how that will be applied and to what level. So there is an inference there that there is going to be one, and it was really part of that second devolution deal what it will look like.
Can we move on to Mary's questions now with just a note about the time pressure that's on us in terms of further arrangements for today, if that's
that
okay.
may mean quick answers or quick questions. I'm not
I
quite
think
sure.
a bit of both, if that's okay.
Thank you. Yes. So the importance of workforce and skills was evidenced in the last your answers to the last set of questions that we asked. If restrictions then are placed on the employment rights of EU citizens, what economic impact would it have for your local areas and your communities generally, and for local areas across the country?
Well, it's a significant issue for us because we import people to work, and both our economies, I mentioned earlier, both the sides of our economy that we have in my patch, whether they be low pay or high paid jobs, have been reliant upon bringing people in from outside of Cambridgeshire to work. So we're in a very fortunate position of having more jobs than people. which is a good and a bad thing, because it has caused and kept wages very low in the north of the county, where agriculture and transport, logistics, etc., and engineering are key. So it's a problem and a success to deal with. So this is why lots of the discussions that I've had with government so far have been based around the ability for people to come in on seasonal contracts and work. And I think that we have to nail that down. As I said, we used to do it, and it's something that we can do again. But equally, there is a concern around the life science sector that they will be able to bring in as many scientists as we need to fill the economy. Cambridge is creating 44,000 jobs in the next 15 years. Almost all of them in life science and technology. Now, clearly, even if I was to have my skills agenda up and running as perfectly as possible, it would still mean that people would have to come in from elsewhere in the world to take advantage of those jobs. So we have to make sure we have a simple visa system. We have to make sure that people are able to come in and work, not just from Europe, obviously, but from anywhere in the world in the sectors that we need to fill. And as I have been engaging with government on this, it is absolutely key to our economy. We simply can't fill considerable portions of our job needs just by people from within the UK. There just isn't the skill sector in Cambridge or in the country to fill all of those life science jobs that are coming. That's obvious to everybody. And it's always been an economy that hasn't exported a lot in goods, but exports an awful lot in people and imports a lot in people. And almost everybody you speak to who works in that technology and science area around our county have worked also in San Diego, San Francisco, Boston, Singapore. And they cluster together for a reason, and they take advantage of each other for a reason. If we are to continue to lead the world in genomics and lead Europe in science and technology, we have to allow these people to move in and out and be part of our economy.
The Greater Manchester Combined Authority is publishing a paper, Greater Manchester and Brexit, with figures on this, and I'll just give you them quickly. Distribution, hotels, restaurants, 26,000 EU nationals are working in those sectors, 14,000 in banking and finance, manufacturing, 13,000 EU nationals, and then public services, particularly health, 12,000 EU nationals. So those are the Greater Manchester figures. And obviously, if they reduce as a result of Brexit, that does create that skills shortage that I mentioned a moment ago that people are getting worried about. And here's the problem. Just at this moment when we are looking at these skill shortages emerging relatively quickly, national skills policy is faltering, particularly the apprenticeship levy. Now, actually, to be honest, to be fair to the government, I think they've done a lot in this space recently around technical education, and it's welcome. I very much welcome it. But we're seeing a situation here for the research that we've done, and I know this is true for Liverpool City region as well, because we've been collaborating with Steve Rotherham on this. There's been a drop of about a quarter in apprenticeship starts as a result of the introduction of the apprenticeship levy. Now, that is too serious for us just to sit here as we're kind of hitting a potential skills shortage and we know that things are going wrong. And all of the things we've debated today, I think skills is the most urgent. You know, it's traditionally been an issue, hasn't it? A second order issue for Whitehall. And it's always been the thing that is kind of, oh, well, we'll get round to it, Under governments of all colours, it's now really urgent. It's absolutely at the top of the agenda from our point of view. Businesses are just demanding that that's the case. But I think this is to get to the nub of it. I said before that maybe government ministers weren't always speaking with one voice. When you look at government departments, they're definitely not doing that on devolution. And the Department for Education, I'll let other mayors speak for themselves, but from my point of view, and I think it's true for Steve as well, they are the least supportive department of what we're trying to do. And they are actively kind of delaying, frustrating. So we were due to have devolution of the adult skills budget, and that's been delayed. And it's not, honestly, not good enough. I don't think you can run a successful skills policy from the national level. truthfully, the country's never done it. The status quo has never worked anyway, because we have a very poor technical education system in this country, a very patchy system. The time has, if that's not worked, the time has come to free us up and let us do something. At least give us the underspend on that apprenticeship levy. I mean, if you look at the combined underspend of, obviously organisations like Manchester United, Manchester City, the NHS, we've got big donation, big kind of levies being paid by large organisations, and that money's just sitting there. And actually, the fear is it's going to go back to the Treasury in a couple of years if it's left unspent. I mean, that just cannot make sense. So, the committee could help actually shed some light here on a ridiculous situation, which is we're heading towards a brick wall on skills, and actually regions are not yet freed up to do something about it. In the budget last year, we were offered local skills panels, I think, a kind of a piece of bureaucracy that I don't think any of us feel we particularly need. It just felt like saying something for the sake of saying something. We need a much better response than that.
In the northeast, migration is fairly low anyway, but I tend to split these things into three categories, the third of which is kind of crowbarred in. One is we do have a significant level of low-paid migrant work in the area that certainly we're seeing on the ground can have a suppression effect on wages, especially at the lower end of the market. The Tees Valley at the minute is currently made up of 40% of its economy is made up of low-paid service sector work, of which we do see on the ground, certainly on an anecdotal level, that migrant work is an additional factor suppressing those wages. We do then have an emerging sector, which is smaller, but hopefully going to be extremely significant, of highly skilled workers from across the world, actually mostly from outside of the European Union, mostly from Korea and Japan, of research and development scientists working for companies like Fujifilm Diosynth, who are one of the largest employers of research and development scientists in the country, and they find it extremely difficult to attract talent to the UK, not necessarily actually just for access to the UK market, but also there is a perception issue of the area. There's a perception issue of basically anywhere outside of London, which is something I think we need to address. And I think we've also got to be careful not to conflate the EU and Brexit with our skills issue, because the North East Chamber of Commerce last year produced a report that showed that the North East is currently at technical full employment, in that there are more jobs available than there are people looking for work. Now, people often wouldn't think that of the North East, given that it's the second highest, has the second highest level of unemployment. So there's clearly a local skills issue there, which in the short term you can certainly fill with migrant labour, whether it's low paid or highly skilled. But there are substantial people within our local communities who do not have the opportunities that others have afforded to them. The skills agenda isn't working at all from a primary school, secondary school, technical level or a higher education level, and something needs to be done about it. And I would echo not just Andy Burnham and James Palmer, but all of the mayors, that we do need to see far more devolution of our education budget and responsibilities and powers. And I do have to echo that certainly at an official level, DFE are not our friend at the moment when it comes to metro mayors and getting more responsibility over that, because you cannot go into a meeting with a business and not talk about skills. It is the number one thing on their agenda, and often it's not necessarily about inward migration from the European Union or outside. It's often about actually having people prepared for the new type of economy that we're going to have. And actually a huge number of the people that we do have who are not UK citizens tend to be from the Asian subcontinent as well, who actually feel that there will be a liberation of potentially further migration from the Asian subcontinent, whereas they had many difficulties and do have many difficulties with bringing families, friends and other people who are qualified to work within their businesses that they can't currently do at present.
In just setting the scene for us in London, our health service is twice as reliant on EU staff as the rest of the country. In our financial sector in London counts for 35% of our employment. In the finance and insurance sector, 12% of its employees are born in the European area. In construction, whilst it's 13% of construction workers across the UK, in London and the South East the proportion is 50%. And in London, 25% of those construction sector workers are born in the EEA area. And the same in hospitality. Andy mentioned hospitality. We, you know, in the UK, nearly a quarter of all hospitality jobs are carried out for people from the EU. In London, it rises to 32%. So in terms of training, you know, exactly right where the Metro mayors are coming from. The mayor, we've got planned development of the further education sector. That's to be welcomed. But we need some more substantial development in this sector. And I think it is one of the departments that's not quite on board. And if you, again, if I go back to what I said, if you want to rise to the challenges of Brexit and how to keep ahead in these difficult and, you know, who can guess what the future challenges are, then we need to think differently about the Brexit skills. And on the table, I think it is best that that's done at regional level. Government has a role in that, but, you know, more of the same is not going to help in this sector, I think. And I think the long-term consequences of what we faced from the past, you know, social policy issues in terms of skills or the lack of a skills strategy, we've been tinkering at it, and we need to think differently post-Brexit.
How should this post-Brexit skills gap be addressed then? Because you've mentioned a regional approach towards it. And the government has asked the Migration Advisory Committee to consider options to help to address this issue. Do you think that they have effectively consulted on this, and what would you be saying to them?
Well, this is something, and the other mayors have mentioned this, and I think we've all got a clear idea of where we can go on this and how we need to make a difference. And it is about devolving education powers to the mayors, but it's about devolving not just, I don't want to go down the route of how the county councils and councils used to be run, of having a little bit of education. This is about devolving the ability to set curriculum and the ability to invest in schools and make sure that schools are judged in a different way. And until we solve this problem within education, that the only way to be successful is to get 5A to C's, to go to university and get a job. Until we address that problem, we will always have a skills shortage in the UK. Now, there's a problem within schools as well, that a university is seen as the only way to get higher level training and get higher level jobs. Clearly, we know that the skills agenda, there are people doing high level apprenticeships, and that's great, and that's something we should absolutely be pushing on. But at the moment, schools are judged clearly on their 5A to C's. If you're a school that's not doing quite as well, you might be doing better as a school if you're getting 30% 5A to C's, but if you're invested in as a school to invest into the skills agenda, and you're sending the other 70% of your pupils through to do apprenticeships, then you've got a different outlook for schools across the UK. And it's all very well for government to set a Westminster-based policy for the United Kingdom for education, but I think the evidence before our eyes is that it doesn't matter what hue the government is, a Westminster-based agenda for education doesn't work. And I said this earlier, you know, what Andy needs or Ben needs in their patch is different to what I need in Cambridgeshire. And I need to feed my economy. And I need to feed my economy with scientists, with agriculture workers, with agri-tech, with engineers. These are the people that I need in my economy. But my schools are not sending me, or not sending businesses, the people that they need. There's absolutely no worth to my economy for people to go and do a media degree in Manchester or wherever, when I need people to be educated in a different way. And I also want, and I also want to solve the problem with disaffection in society. I can't solve everything, but politicians are in the solutions business. If we've got a problem with disaffection in society, if that disaffection led partially to the Brexit vote, well, there's a damn good reason for that. Because if you're looking at other people who are getting opportunities because their skill set is academic, and your skill set may not be academic, and you're feeling that you've had a lack of investment as a person, then of course you're going to be disaffected. And we cannot continue as a country to just completely cut people out of society because they're told from the age of 7 or 8 the only way to success is through academia. And until we change that, we will continue to fail massive parts of our population, and they will feel disaffected, and they will be part of the low-wage economy, or they won't even be part of society at all.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I love his passion on this, because actually I agree.
One thing I would say is because education does seem to be a common theme, it may well be that, you know, there'll be a lot of echoing or not.
I was just about to, because James's passion is something I share. Not only is education policy in our country over-centralised, within that, an obsession with the university route predominates. And that has led to a situation that James describes. So you have a lot of teenagers who I think lose a sense of hope and purpose at secondary school because they can't see where school is taking them if it's not on the UCAS route. And that, I think, is a major part of our problem in terms of having inequality and a divided society. And I think urgently, young people who want technical education need to be given something to aim for in the same way that university students have. So my answer, Mary, is I've talked about the need for a UCAS-style system for apprenticeships in Greater Manchester. The real power of that is it would allow businesses here to drive the education system in a way that they've never been able to do. Because if they can set, you know, here's our apprenticeships, these are the courses we want, this is the grades that you will need to get to apply, it will be able to match young people with opportunity in a way that we can't at the moment. But also it will be real opportunities in the Greater Manchester labour market that will then shape what happens in schools. And at the moment, I just think teachers and parents are well placed to advise young people because they can't really see the job opportunities that are out there. We hear of digital jobs in this city going unfilled because the pipeline is just not delivering. And we've got ambitions around the green economy. We're having a green summit later this week where we're going to be talking about retrofitting properties. And there's a new demand for skills coming through here that the system at the moment just isn't geared up to deliver. So, yeah, I don't want to say a great deal more because you can see where we're coming from. It's never been, this issue has never been fixed at a national level. The best hope we've got is devolve it, let businesses in those regions, sub-regions, then drive the system. And I come back to it, how can it make sense to have all of that money sitting in the apprenticeship levy unspent when it's money raised from Greater Manchester companies, when we're at a moment here where we urgently need to get on and do something about skills? You know, if the committee could find its way to recommend something in that space, I think it would be enormously helpful to us all. Okay.
Yes, briefly. I think what devolution gives you is it allows business to align with education on a regional level. So we have a local industrial strategy, we have a strategic economic plan, we have priority sectors where we know the areas that we do well in and where they're going to grow. And having that conversation and being that convener with the education sector, while we don't have direct control at the moment or potentially ever, we've got now FE leaders who completely buy into our sector action plans, our strategic plans and the growing sectors. And so my FE leaders are coming to me and saying, you don't worry about education anymore, just start producing the jobs because we'll make sure they're ready. And, Middlesbrough College, the largest college in the Tees Valley, they're getting a lot of kids, a huge percentage of their kids are doing STEM subjects. The issue now is having the jobs there that are available. And so it's a really good example of where the combined authority and the mayors are able to set a strategy, get buy-in from education, and then actually the onus is back on us to create the jobs.
And would you want all post-16 devolved?
Yes. Well, I think, and again, I wouldn't want to speak for the mayors that aren't here, but I think the conversations that we've had is that we would be looking to move to devolution of all post-16.
Yes, but can I just go back to the Migration Advisory Committee? They've only been asked to look at shortages. I think what we've heard here is a much more ambitious skills agenda fit for this country moving into the challenges post-Brexit. And that's the bit they've not been asked to do, because the Home Office is looking at the short-term, potential shortages and what can be done about if the supply of labour is restricted. They need to have their terms of reference widened. It was done by the Home Secretary, looking from their particular point of view, rather than from a wider government view about what skills is, and is this an opportunity to look at the skills strategy now and change if we're going to face up to those challenges in the future.
Could I ask, have you been able to feed that back? Because this is about a consultation. Has that been fed back?
Yep. As written back very to the Migration Advisory Committee, outlining that very issue, saying, hold on, there's some wider issues here, and we would agree that the post-16 needs to be devolved.
We just touched on before, Mary, that the Metro mayors, I think at least 5 of us met in Birmingham last month. And we, as I say, you couldn't have differentiated who was speaking, I think it's fair to say. And Andy Street, don't want to kind of speak for him today, but he did say something similar. So, and there were officials there from the DFE, from Treasury, from your department, you Shadow. They did, it has been fed back. What we're saying is the usual Whitehall slow pace of doing things won't work here. It needs to be quicker.
We've also had nothing from the MAC or any engagement with them so far.
One question to you, if I may. You spoke earlier about free ports and the importance of it. What are the advantages for Teesside of having a free port?
I think it would be revolutionary. It would create a massive step change for our area. It would reshore manufacturing jobs not seen in this country for many decades. And it would allow us to set a more regionally focused industrial strategy that sees, the economy being rebalanced. And, it's an area, in part, that voted more heavily for Brexit than basically anywhere else in the country. And this is a demonstrable benefit from Brexit that would see many thousands of jobs be created within the Tees Valley, especially with what we saw a couple of years ago around the closure of the SSI Steelworks. It would be significant to the point that if you haven't already and you're not aware of it, I would suggest some light reading of Rishi Sunak's Freeport study for the Centre of Policy Studies, which is a good example of that. And we're currently in the process of, we've made a formal submission to government through the Treasury to commission a joint study on using Teesport as a Freeport pilot post-Brexit, with a view that if demonstrating its success, then it could potentially be rolled out to other ports or indeed free zone areas, because it doesn't necessarily have to be specific to ports.
Okay, thank you. Final question from Liz, and if I can emphasise the importance of brevity once again, if that's okay in your answers.
So my question is about the Committee of the Regions and what happens post-Brexit. So the Secretary of State recently said the government's exploring how the Committee of Regions may be replicated in a non-statutory way domestically to enable local government to comment on and influence domestic legislation. What should such a body look like in the UK? And should it be statutory or non-statutory?
To me, it seems superfluous to requirements. We've got other bodies that can deliver the same objectives, whether it be the Metro Mayor Cluster, the LGA. There we work on a cross-regional basis as well. I think there are other more effective mechanisms to be able to deliver it. And so whether we have one or not, it certainly shouldn't be statutory, but I would question the need to have a replacement at all, given the other bodies that can fill that space anyway.
I think given the fact that none of us jumped in immediately to support a body of the regions would probably give you an idea that that we're not, it's not something that we see as something, I'm not talking about other people who come and say something different, but it's certainly not something I see any positive in or any need to go down that route. So in using the brevity that we've been asked for, what he said.
I think we're also delighted to get so much of this off our chest. That's why we're talking at length. But I see more merit in it, if I'm honest, because going back to that point about a new settlement, I think the idea that this country is run on a slightly, ad hoc series of arrangements where some areas have access and some don't, it's not healthy. And I think it needs to be put on a much clearer footing, because I actually feel in the end that's what created Brexit. This kind of sense underlying that some people just weren't being heard and the country's being run in the interest of one area more than another. So if we're to respond properly to Brexit, I think it is more devolution, as we're saying, giving us more control over that funding we used to get from Europe, certainly power over skills, but then a kind of an ongoing sense that in this more federal structure, every area has its voice. I mean, I don't want Greater Manchester to be seen as the London of the North. I really don't want that. It's why we're talking of a convention of the North, because we want to ensure that even areas without mayors can link with us and we can help advocate for them as well at the same time. But I do feel in the long run, putting all of this on a much clearer kind of basis, in the same way that the devolved administrations have that kind of regular access to government, I think that's got to make sense. There is a risk here that if devolution stops here as well, we're going to get a two-tier kind of sense here, aren't we? That some areas have mayors and devolution, other areas don't. That I would say the government's got to crack on and give devolution to more places, and then more power to those that have already got mayors. And the Committee of the Regions will be a good vehicle to oversee that process.
Well, we're not allowed to talk about regions, or it used to be the way in some ways. But look, I think you've got to see it in terms of the devolved settlement. I think it would be strange to bring the Scottish local government to meet English local government to talk about the local government settlement, because a lot of that would be with the Scottish Parliament. In many ways, it isn't in terms of a UK government. So it needs to be thought through, and I think there does need to be a body. Are you being done to, or should we be aspiring to being working with and developing policies for the future with each other? So whether it's the Metro mayors coming together on the regional bit to get that bit right in terms of government policies, or whether it's England, I'll have to check on the Welsh Assembly where it is. We do a lot of work with our scrutiny bodies in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Do you know what I mean? It's a bit difficult in Northern Ireland now because of the circumstances. We've shared most of our Brexit work. These are very good relationships developed, but I think government needs to get its relationship right. So I don't think, I don't agree with Ben about its purpose. It's about, well, what is it? It's got to be business-like and it's got to be about that. But are we in jointly trying to develop policies that work, or is it just going to come from central government? I think this is a different challenge we're facing now in the future, and we need that different relationship. I would say this, local government, and what one of the issues that might be interesting. So London is open, it's a campaign the Mayor has done. I think that's quite successful. Post-Brexit, we hear government saying we are going to be good partners with Europe. Local government should still be partners with its European issues, and the LGA is talking about how do you establish that good practice arrangements with our partners on the European continent post-Brexit. And we should be alive to that, because a lot of some of the problems they face are slim to us. We might be working in different contexts, different structures, but I think sharing good practice. I used to be on the Council of Europe in the Chamber of Regions, where they did topical work, but also where some of the treaties were discussed in the Chamber. Slightly different body from the Committee of Regions, but I think it's, look, good local government practitioners have an eye about what's going on in other countries and about their work. There's a lot more that brings us together than divides us in understanding, and good officials that have experience of working outside their regions even, or across in different countries, are a good asset to any organisation and institution. So local government should be open as much as government should be open in terms of its relationship, and keep these links going where possible.
And that's a very good note on which to end. Can I thank all of our witnesses for both the time that you've given this morning and the evidence that you provided to our inquiry. You are, of course, very, very welcome to write to us with any points of detail that you feel there wasn't time to explore today, and we will feed that evidence into our inquiry as well. But thank you very much for coming today. Order, that brings us to the end of our formal proceedings. Thank you.